Thank you very much, Chairperson. I'm actually the director of the International Bureau of Education in Geneva, the Bureau of Education, which is a UNESCO institute. I'll try. I also have to apologize that I won't be able to stay for the Q&A after this because I do have to rush to the airport. Thank you very much. Before I start my address, I'd like to congratulate my colleague and friend, the director of the Institute, Dr. Don Fried, for his astuteness in selecting the themes for these conferences that enable us to actually have a continuous and meaningful dialogue from year to year, which indeed we should. Last year, when I was here, I spoke about the invisible walls of the 21st century and what needs to be done to break them down, because we were commemorating the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I thought I'll continue my discourse and ask the question, when we break the visible and the invisible walls, are we collecting enough bricks to build bridges for peace and reconciliation in the 21st century? So I want to focus on building bridges from the bricks of the walls that we break down. And this is where we were last year. The answer to the question actually gives us the contradictions of the 21st century, because it seems we are in a century where always the answer is yes and no. Yes, we are breaking walls, visible and invisible. Yes, we are collecting the bricks and we are building bridges, but perhaps not load-bearing bridges, strong enough to bear the load of peace and reconciliation. So I thought I'll take some highlights of the evidence of the walls we are breaking and the bricks we are collecting. If we just remember that the post-war institutions, like the UN and the Bretton Woods Institute, were mainly created to promote peace, reconciliation, to promote collaboration across nations and across individuals, and to ensure that never again would the world be embroiled in conflict and wars. And if you look at the signatories to the UN, the countries that have joined the UN since the first 51 countries in 1945, we are almost covering the world with 195. This suggests that countries subscribe to the value and notion and the effect of peace and reconciliation. Otherwise, they would not join an institution like the UN, whose key mandate is to promote peace, reconciliation, and collaboration. A sister institution whose mandate is to promote peace through its areas of competency, which is UNESCO. Its membership is also increasing from 37 in 1945 to now 195. Excuse me, it is UNESCO that is at 195 countries plus 10 observer countries, whereas the UN has 195 plus 2 observer countries. So one may expect to see the reduction of conflict, and indeed there are some good signs that these bricks are building peace and reconciliation. If you look at the reduction in the peacekeeping missions of the UN from 71 in 1948 to 16 in 2015, and the number of countries that contribute to these, 100 countries, over 100 countries. If we also take note of the fact that the fatality rate of peacekeeping missions of the UN is actually declining. So while we may still have conflicts, the actual loss of human life among the peacekeeping missions of the UN is actually declining, which is a good sign. And we have seen also UNESCO's effort to promote the culture of peace, to have peace education, human rights education, and many other aspects of education that ultimately, its ultimate impact is to promote peace and reconciliation. These are some of the initiatives that UNESCO has launched over decades. I'm not going to go into the details because we are pressured for time. Countries are democratizing, so the number of democracies are increasing. From 1989, we see 69 to 125. So if democracies are increasing, we should expect the respect of many rights and freedoms and the actual sanctity of peace at the individual level, peace and security at the individual and at the collective level. But I underline the should with red because it's just a should, and we will see why later. And those of you who were here last year will remember how I spoke on democracy, that democracy is a label, is an idea, and there are many shades of governance labeled democracy. The question is, what is a democracy? But I will refrain from repeating my last year's speech and go on. All I want to say is that we should all actually be talking of good governance rather than democracy, and then just let a rose be a rose, whatever we call it. We have seen promising country experiences and practices of peace and reconciliation. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. South Africa, anybody could argue, had every right to be embroiled in a vicious cycle of revenge and counter-revenge because those who had been brutalized by apartheid really had the right to say, it's your turn. But the country had the discipline and the integrity and the understanding of what this could result in. So they built the bridges and reached to one another and reconciled. And today we haven't seen South Africa get embroiled in a never-ending war and conflict. It's not easy, but it's an example to follow. There are other examples. Rwanda is trying. The former Yugoslav countries are also trying. We've seen a proliferation of academic institutions and programs that promote peace, security, reconciliation. One of them, we are standing right here. This whole cultural diplomacy is about ultimately promoting peace and reconciliation through intercultural exchange and the rapprochement de culture. We also have seen, through the facilitation of ICTs and ease of travel in the 21st century, the ability to increase exposure and interaction across the diversity of who we are, whether this exposure is virtual, through the internet, through the television, and so on and so forth. The fact remains that the 21st century is a century where we actually interact more across borders and across time zone and all sorts of zones than the 21st century. And one hopes that when this interaction escalates, the fear of the unknown, the lack of trust, the sizing of one another will go down, because as I interact with you, I get to know you, I get to appreciate you, and I get to see more commonality between you and me than if you were an unknown. So these are some of the bricks that we are building. We've seen a lot of push of the equity and equality imperative across all facets of life. And as I said last year, societies that are known to have high levels of inequality are also very prone to social fracture, political instability, conflict, lack of peace, high crime rates, incarcerations, and so on and so forth. So the global push for equity, the global policy on equity and inclusion is a key brick that I want to highlight. I'm not going to go into examples. You can look at them when you have time. Another example of the reduction in inequality has been the decline in poverty through the push of the Millennium Development Goals that will be sustained through the Sustainable Development Goals. And we can see this decline. And if the world is becoming less stressed, less poor, less inequitable, hopefully we should see better peace and reconciliation. The question then is, are we getting there? Let's go back to democracy. I showed you this graph of increasing democracy. But the contradiction of the 21st century is while the countries that have the label democracy attached to their governments are actually increasing, the number of the decline in the acceptance of the core principles of what constitutes a democracy is actually increasing. So the labels are increasing, but the democracy, effective democracy, is not necessarily increasing. And last year, I also spoke about this and said that to me, democracy is when people are fulfilled, they enjoy the peace, they have high enjoyment of life, they have security, their rights are respected, and so on. But the countries that are actually violating these core principles of democracy are increasing. So we go back to what is a democracy? But as I said, I will try not to. And this is another example of the declines across the 5 of the categories that are used as indicators of democracy, some of them mainly civil freedoms and so on. And you can see here, I just gave you examples of the global status in terms of the number of countries that are rated as free, partially free, not free, and some of the characteristics that lead to this. So democracy label may be increasing, but the effective democracy is not necessarily increasing, and therefore we do continue to see scuffle. And here we are. The global terrorism incident is actually on the rise. So this comes the contradiction. If there are so many factors that increase the rapprochement, why do we still have fracture? And I'll give you some of the few examples, just the increase, just between 2014 and 2015, there has been an 80% increase in the deaths that are attributed to terrorism, and this excludes the recent incidents in France. And some of the key contributing countries are Iraq, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria. 78% of incidents of terrorism are actually from these countries. I'm not going to go through each of these bullet points. I just want to focus on the highlights. And this is the continuance of this. And Syria alone contributes 4 million refugees and 7 million IDPs. So it's not just terrorism, it's also the number of internally displaced people is increasing. And this is an issue. The drivers or correlates of terrorism include what? High group grievances emanating mainly from abuse of rights and poor governance, particularly state-sponsored abuse of human rights. Safety, insecurity, religious violations, religious violence, suppression of other people's religions, or the effort by other religions to want to convert others to their religions, and the intolerance. These are some of the examples of the correlates of democracy, but I want to focus the 2 main drivers of terrorism, the states that have high incidence of terrorism, is actually political violence. So the issue here is that terrorism tends to be higher in countries where the governance is poor. And examples are political imprisonment, state-sanctioned extrajudicial killings, torture, mass violence against civilians, against certain religions, and so on and so forth. So it seems that if we could actually target governance and stop labeling ourselves democracies when we are not, perhaps we would get closer to the 21st century that is peaceful and reconciled. The second cause is violence of terrorism is really the areas where there is armed conflict. When there is armed conflict in an area, it tends to be that after the armed conflict, there is a rise of terrorism, probably because of the chasm, but also probably because the whole place is littered with arms that are uncontrolled. And then they land in hands that may not necessarily be responsible. The refugees and internally displaced people, 16 million, and this is the highest level of increase since 2014 and the highest since the World War. So the question is, why are these bricks that we are getting from the walls we break down not bearing the load of peace and reconciliation? And you can see the level of terrorism at the level of internally displaced people correlating with the number of deaths that are due to terrorism. But lack of peace isn't just a state of war or terrorism or whatever. There is lack of peace when I feel unsafe at the individual, the security of a person. And violence claims more lives than terrorist acts. While terrorism tends to reach the news highlight, violence to the individuals and groups actually claims more deaths annually than terrorism. 437,000 people are murdered each year, which is 13 times more than the deaths that are attributed to terrorism. So we are a violent 21st century. The question is, where is this violence coming from? And what could we do to reach out to each other? And the cost of violence is 32 times that of terrorism. Violence against women particularly, if you look at the statistics, just simply horrifying. When we see from female genital mutilation, just violent acts that actually are an affront to sexual violation of women and girl child. If you look at this, just take a look at the UN Women's statistics when you have time. You will wonder what on earth is going on here. What then could be done? As I said, governance matters, and it's a preventative measure. And countries that have good governance structures tend to be peaceful. And countries that emerge from violence and conflict into good governance, as I said, South Africa is an example, tend to manage to be peaceful. They may have problems, but every country does. But the key fundamental point, if we want the 21st century that's reconciled and peaceful, we have to pay close attention to governance. We have to pay attention to collective intervention in geographical hotspots. While we have a rise in terrorism, a rise in crime, the consoling side is that these incidents are geographically concentrated. So if collectively there could be a resolve to target these areas and address the root cause, not the symptoms of violence and wars and fracture, then we could. But we have seen how wars can go on, and every day on television, the countdown of the number of deaths just keeps increasing. And it's as if everything can be done tomorrow, while the world is paralyzed. The question is, where is the sense and the source of this paralysis? Why is it okay for us to watch people die from governments that slaughter people or allow it to happen and nothing happens? Unfortunately, I can't answer. Education with a particular focus on the rights of individuals, and also education of youth, for youth holistic engagement. Because youth, by nature, they are young and restless. They will do something. Youth are always active. That's the beauty of it. But the question is, do we give them the enablement to be active in a constructive way? Because active they will be. Also, looking at global citizenship education, that actually promotes collectively articulated and owned universal values. We've had a long dialogue on universal values. Before most of you were born, I was told that this is the room that is full of people who are younger than when I started my practice in education. And the point is that when we talk about universal values, they have to be universally owned, and they have to be universally articulated. And the process of articulating these values should not come as an imposition of these values, because when the values come as an imposition, they get to be alienating and they become a source of fracture. And you could have seen the critique on social media to President Obama's statement that the recent attack wasn't just on France, but was on the universal values that we subscribe to. And whoops, such a reasonable statement, in my humble opinion, because there's nothing universal about values, Mr. President, and you could see the social media going on. And it made me pause and think, why was something that is so intuitive provoking this conversation? Because while we may agree that equality is equality, maybe the way we express equality may not necessarily be universal. The way we express respect, if we take it too far south, and you want to tell me that the way a woman should show respect to a man is to be subservient, then this very principle that we started off agreeing on, that respect is universal, then becomes something else. And I think, then I don't subscribe to that form of respect. So it is really important that we invest the time required in the dialogue, this sort of dialogue that Don Fry calls us to annually, to come up with these universal values and have the patience to consult, to own, and the readiness to give effect, because we can have all the list of universal values we want, but if they are lists, they are paper. They are not values, because values are what we practice. I can stand here and talk about equity, but if I look down upon another person, my value is inequality, whatever I may pontificate. If a government labels itself a democracy, but it slaughters its own people and violates their rights, then it is not a democracy. Forget it. Forget what it may label itself. So the actualization of what we say is actually more important as steps towards a reconciled and peaceful 21st century. We talk of global citizenship, but how we define what is global is very important, because this concept, as innocent as it may sound, it makes others feel very queasy, that perhaps this global is some regions of the world and not others. So these are some of the points. We need to balance then the particularistic values with the universality of values. And we need to balance the expression of a value or the concept and distinguish the concept from its example. And as I said, we can agree on the concept, but not how it's exemplified across context, because the exemplification begins to violate the very value we started with. If we say that discipline is a value, and I say in my culture corporal punishment, and I can beat the heck out of a child, and it's discipline, we start to say, perhaps we all agree that we all should be disciplined, but now if this is how you express discipline, so it isn't enough to write words. It's good enough that we actualize, we express and operationalize their meaning, and we express them if we want reconciliation and peace. We need to also refrain from an exclusion language. After attacks, I'm going to use my own country as an example, but it didn't happen in my country, but I can use my country as an example. We have seen the emergence of values that are labeled in an exclusionist language, like Botswana values in the curriculum. If I were in Botswana not as a Botswana citizen, and you start to label these values and you own them and you appropriate them, you may alienate me so that I start to think these are not my values, they are Botswana values or Botswana values. But if we talked about humanity and human values, perhaps we can then break this, the so-and-so's values. So I get very tight when I see these labels. We need, as I said, to break the vicious cycle of revenge and counter-revenge, by acknowledging that not revenging after you were violated is not a sign of cowardice. And it's not a sign of lack of resolve. It's actually a sign of high ground, just simply high ground. Because forgiveness rewards more the forgiver than the forgiven. Because the forgiver never did anything wrong anyway. So this is the discipline. What we see invariably is after being violated, the human instinct is to hit back. And then the other one hits back. And then even if the Bible says turn the other cheek, finally there's no more cheek to slap because they are too swollen from the slaps. So how can we refrain from this and follow the Nelson Mandela example, where he refused to lift a hand, even though the world would have unanimously say he is justified? Perhaps we need also to look at our language. We talk a lot about tolerance, diversity, inclusion. Once you say diverse, to me, I'm looking at this, and we are working on these areas actively in the institute that I run. And it just struck me, perhaps if I start from the point of view that you and I are different, I'm already building a wall. Because then you are different. How am I going to tolerate you? How am I going to understand you? So perhaps we should start from the point of view of commonality. Because the truth is that we can all meet in this room as strangers and interact very nicely and actually enjoy the interaction. Because to humanity, there is much more that binds us together as human beings than that separates us. So the particularistic ring is on the fringe, but the universal ring is the core and is the middle and is bigger. And maybe we should take an asset approach to our language, and instead of talking about accepting and tolerating differences, we should highlight commonalities and then deal with the fringes of the diversity if we want to balance the particularistic with the universalistic. These are some of the values, but as I said, all these values are words until we operationalize them. And at this point, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Don Fried, for inviting me, and thank you very much for listening. And I'm sorry I have to run. Thank you very much.